And now, from the great state of Mississauga in Ontario, Canada, it's the Ted Woloshyn Podcast. Brought to you by ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. ETP Canada. And Tom's Place, for the finest in men's fashion. Tom's Place will suit you. And now, here's Ted.
Hi there, and welcome to the podcast. My guest today co-created and performed on CBC's This Hour Has 22 Minutes and created and starred in Made in Canada and Talking to Americans, the most watched comedy special in Canadian television history. He then went on to host the hugely successful Rick Mercer Report for 15 seasons. In 2014, he was appointed an Officer of the Order of Canada, and in 2019, he received a Governor General's Performing Arts Lifetime Artistic Achievement. Welcome, Rick Mercer. You know, I have to admit, Rick, that I was somewhat surprised that you'd written a memoir, because from what I've read, what I've heard, you pretty much keep to yourself. You're not extroverted in that sense. You're certainly not a braggart, and you're still a young man. So a memoir, to me, I thought, well, that's really interesting. But then after reading the book, I realized that it isn't as much of a memoir as it is a fascinating and very funny, drawn-out monologue. And it's like a funny yet warm rant.
Well, thank you very much. I consider that a great compliment.
Well, I
yes, I've always been. Well, I am a bit of an introvert. I've always, and I have been in the public eye for a long time, working on TV, but I just had a subject matter that I prefer to talk about. That was always politics and current events and what was happening in the country and pop culture, whatever. And I just didn't find myself that interesting a subject matter. And so I just really didn't talk about myself that much. Also, I felt as a political commentator, the less people knew sometimes the better, because people start making assumptions. So it's not like I was hiding the fact I grew up in Middle Cove, or I had two parents I liked and we had a goat, no pony, or any of that business, or that I worked at the LSPO Hall. It was just never came up.
But it's interesting because, you know, you so much of your living is made finding the little things about people that you can expand into humor. And a lot of that is finding their faults. And by writing a memoir, you're exposing yourself and leaving yourself wide open for the same kind of fault finding.
I guess so. I guess that's all part of the package. I'm not a very reflective person, so it was an interesting process. I got to say, I've been very lucky. The thing that I'm most proud of in my life is that I've always had a job and work to do. And so that kept me busy and moving forward on to the next project, what have you. So I never really sat around and reflected on much. So it was an interesting exercise. But it was also, I don't know if I would have done it if there wasn't a pandemic or not. I honestly can't tell you.
Uh-huh. You weren't much for school. It's not that you didn't like school itself and the students, but you weren't much of a student.
No.
And in retrospect, you look back and you regret that you didn't take advantage of an education.
Oh, sure. It's a big regret of mine for a couple of reasons. One, well, I just didn't figure out how to do it. And it didn't interest me, but really that shouldn't have made a difference, because since then I've certainly, put my nose to the grindstone and done things that don't particularly interest me. Mm-hmm. I tell you one thing, when you're a terrible student and you're not doing your assignments and you're missing a lot of school and you're falling behind, there's a constant level of anxiety that goes with that. You're constantly treading water. You're having the nightmare and you don't know what day it is and the assignment's not done. And of course, the assignment's not done. And it would have just been so much easier if I just buckled down and did the work. And quite frankly, in hindsight, I don't think it is a lot of work. Is it a lot of work to do well in grade 8? I don't necessarily think so. But it certainly seemed like a lot of work at the time. Yeah. And I should point out that I was a terrible student, but it's not like there was any excuse. I grew up in a nice house. I had parents who believed in education. I didn't have a learning disability. I mean, there was nothing really. There's nothing I could point at and go, well, I struggled because of A, B, or C.
But when you look back at the years you spent in high school, 4 years in high school, back when I went, it was 5, but I was here in Ontario. for you in the East Coast, it was 4 years. Was the one person that you met the most important person at that point in your life? Would that have been Lois Brown?
Oh, absolutely. She was the drama teacher. And I often wonder what would have happened if she wasn't there, because I joined the drama club. I didn't necessarily want to be an actor. Actually, I didn't think about that at all. I was drawn to it. And I can't help but think what would have happened if like almost every other school in North America, if there was a drama teacher that was mostly concerned with doing musicals or classical theater, I might have lasted 5 minutes. But Lois was very much a part of the collective tradition of Newfoundland theater. She wanted us to write and create our own shows about things that we were interested in. And it was a total game changer for me. And one day when I was going to quit the drama festival, the drama club, because I was working backstage, I didn't particularly like it. I said, I'm going to quit. And she said, oh, this could be the biggest mistake of your life. And I thought that was a little over the top, It's just an extracurricular activity, lady. And I said, why? And she said, because the next show, we're going to enter into the Provincial Drama Festival. And I said, what's the show? And she said, I don't know. You haven't written it yet. Well, at that point, no one suggested that I would write a show or write anything, really. And so I stuck around, and she assembled this group of kids, half of whom I would think today would just be justifiably called at risk. And we created our own show. It had a punk band. We made fun of other schools. We were pushing the boundaries of taste. The jokes were pretty good. And it was the most exhilarating thing I was ever involved in. And everything was different after that. That's all I ever did after that, was write jokes and try to get on stage and tell them.
It's quite ironic when you think that you've created this terrific career in television, and yet you grew up in television was something that you saw for maybe an hour or two a week. Your dad referred to it as the idiot box.
Yeah, my parents are wonderful, wonderful people, and they're tremendous parents. But as young newlyweds, they got this foolish notion in their head that they wouldn't have a television until in the house with children until they could afford a piano. Well, my parents, they didn't make any money anyway. And, they had to build a bungalow, and they had 3 kids. There was no money. So it took them a long time to save for that piano. Eventually, someone took pity on us. A friend of my father's had a used television store and gifted us with a black and white. Dad wasn't very impressed. And so their rule was, you could watch 1 or 2 shows a week, and you all had to agree on shows. I mean, it's not like they're completely against it, but that was their views on television, and they didn't think much of it. And of course, I became obsessed and made it my life's work.
He called it the idiot box, and your reaction was, when I grow up, I want to be an idiot.
That's exactly it. There was a show in Newfoundland called The Wonderful Grand Band. This is back when the CBC not only did regional programming, but sometimes shows just for a province. And the Wonderful Grand Band had a super group of Newfoundland musicians and 2 comedians, Tommy Sexton and Greg Malone. Right. And they created this whole world where Tommy and Greg played the groupies and the managers and the school principals, and this whole world. They were comedians. They played all the different characters, and the band acted a little bit. And it was the biggest show in Newfoundland. And
it dominated.
It dominated. So the biggest stars weren't on Dallas. They weren't on Knots Landing. They were these Newfoundlanders. And to me, it was the most exciting thing ever. I just couldn't believe that this was happening in my hometown. And I didn't think, that should be me up there. But I just thought, can you imagine people go to work and do this?
And I think when Yvon Fitzon ran CBC television in Toronto, he actually played the Wonderful Grand Band on Toronto television.
Yeah, he put it on, and the show was purely made for a Newfoundland audience, and he put it on at midnight. And of course, Yvon eventually became a champion of Codco, and that was the comedy troupe that Tommy and Greg were part of, and Yvon put it on national television. But I guess it's no different than, yourself. We all grew up listening to radio, but I know people who grew up listening to radio and dreaming of being in radio and thinking there's no greater thing in the world. And imagine some people go to work in a radio station. And it doesn't even mean that they had to be the one talking into the microphone, but anything at all to do with it. What a gift that would be. And that's kind of the way I felt about television.
Didn't you say that the ones who grew up obsessed with television usually turned out to be directors?
Well, the ones who it was their only friend.
That's right.
Yeah.
So your first foray into performing came via a performance group called Corey and Wade's Playhouse.
Yeah. So when we did that show in high school for the drama festival, and we went off to Gander and took part in the provincial drama festival, my buddy and I, he was in the show, we wrote a comedy sketch together, and we started doing it for all the kids that were at this drama club, at this drama festival. And then we decided, well, we should start a comedy troupe. And when we finish high school, we'll move to Toronto. And apparently you do a show at the Rivoli, and Lorne Michaels comes and sees it, and then you get a TV show. That's the way it works.
Yeah, just like that.
So we started a comedy troupe with two other folks, Ashley Billard and Christine Taylor. And we started doing our own shows at the LSPU Hall downtown. We kind of left high school behind. And lots of kids came out to the shows. And then we started playing bars. And for the next 2 years, we were a going concern. We were like, when you go into a town and there's like a hot rock band that all the kids are going to see, that's what we were like, except we were a comedy troupe. We could sell out any bar. It was really exciting.
Yeah, and at one point, I guess while this was all happening, you had applied for a debit card, which were brand new at the time at the bank, and you were refused. And you got pretty pissed off about it. And somebody suggested that you turn it into part of the presentation, theatrical presentation, and really that's where your first rant was born.
Yeah. Well, I came in and I was just so angry about this newfangled debit cards that you could get, and they wouldn't give me one. And Andrew Younghusband said, we should put that in the show. But there was no sketch, there was no funny hat, there was no costume or anything. So I just did this rant about the banks called I Hate the Banks. And it was the first rant. And then a friend of mine at the time, Alison Zosky, was working at CBC Radio. And she was from Toronto, but she was doing like a summer stint at radio. And she invited me in to record it for the CBC. And I did. And it was my first rant. And the CBC didn't air that one. But it kind of lit the fuse, and I was like, oh, I could start coming in here and doing rants. And so I was washing dishes, and there was this guy who worked at CBC Radio, and I heard he was in charge of who does commentaries on the morning show. And I'd be washing the dishes, and everyone would have to come in and walk past me. Every time this guy, Glenn Tilley, would walk past me, I'd say, what do you got that Rex Murphy on doing commentaries for? How old is he anyway? He must be like 100. Of course, Rex was probably 45 at the time, and I was 17 or 18. And my boss would be like, stop badgering the customers. You can't tell them how to do their job. And I'm like, no one's listening to that guy. And eventually he gave me a shot. And they started airing these commentaries, and they became the rants.
And the rants led to your first one-man show called Rick Mercer's Show Me the Button, I'll Push It, or Charles Lynch Must Die. Now, there's two things about that title that are quite fascinating. Well, three, I mean, if you consider there's violence involved. The fact that your name was in front of the title because you appeared at the National Arts Centre in Ottawa, not the main part of the theater, but an extension of the Arts Centre.
Yeah.
And at that point in Canada, nobody's name appeared above the title.
No, it just wasn't done. But my partner, Gerald Lunds, was the director and the producer. And we're still partners to this day. I mean, we live together. I mean, that way, so business partners and life partners. But at the time, he had very strong feelings about this. And he said, you have to build a brand. And we're going to come in and sell this show like it's a monster hit.
Yeah.
With this superstar from Newfoundland. No one knew who I was. So let's put your name above the title. But the National Arts Centre, they just didn't do that. It was actually a policy. Christ himself could show up and they wouldn't put his name above the title. And so we said, well, that's the name of the show. And Rick's the playwright, and he's named the show Rick Mercer's Show Me the Button, I'll Push It, or Charles Lynch Must Die. And the guy running the National Arts Centre just couldn't believe how cocky we were demanding this, and he let it go. And my name went above the title. And it's something that I've continued my entire career when possible. And it was interesting. It was all Gerald, because I don't have an ego strong enough to go in and demand that. But he insisted on it because he knew that was the way you build a brand and you sell tickets.
And Charles Lynch Must Die. Charles Lynch, a journalist, who had written some disparaging words about Newfoundland.
Yeah, and Charles Lynch was started. You obviously know who Charles Lynch was, but for people who aren't familiar, I mean, Charles Lynch was a major figure in journalism. Yep. He was a war correspondent, did some very, very significant war coverage. He was the head of the Southern News Network, highly respected guy, also wrote humor pieces and a lot of opinion pieces. I mean, to this day, actually, the Press Gallery Theatre in the nation's capital, in Ottawa, is called the Charles Lynch Theatre, highly respected. Anyway, it was during the Meech Lake Accord, and Charles is a retired old cankerous, curmudgeon at this point. And my show is about the Meech Lake Accord, and he writes this column that says, if push comes to shove, let's face it, in this Confederation of Canada, if it came down to Quebec or Newfoundland, this is a no-brainer because Newfoundland's a basket case. We just get rid of them because Quebec is far more important. So I lost my mind.
Yeah, I would imagine.
Being an angry young man. Charles's tongue was in his cheek, but I didn't see that at the time. I was just beside myself. Everyone in Newfoundland was. And so we called the show Charles Lynch Must Die, which is outrageous. That's how angry a young man I was. But Charles did me a favor. He took the ball and ran with it. He wrote another column going, there's a show in the nation's capital, it was in all the papers, called Charles Lynch Must Die. I am the Solomon Rushdie of Newfoundland, and Rick Mercer is the Ayatollah, and he's put a fatwa in my head. Well, the hell with him. I'm going to be front row center on opening night.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, my God. Then we went on. Then we both were interviewed by the Hill Times, and Charles took it. He was so outraged. Suddenly, the show sold out overnight. And I realized he was doing me a very solid favor. And then we went on television together, and I was 19 years old, and there he was in his 70s. You got an old man and a kid yelling at each other about the Canadian Constitution. It was peak CBC.
Yeah.
And the show eventually went on the road, and everywhere we went, Charles would go on the radio with me. We'd scream at each other, and we would sell out. And so he did me a real solid, and we became friends. Charles became sick during my tour of Canada, and he became quite sick. He had emergency surgery, and he was diagnosed with cancer, and the word was that he wasn't long for this world. And I called him up, and I said, we're going into Vancouver. We're dropping Charles Lynch Must Die from the poster. The show's now just called Show Me the Button, I'll Push It. And he said, why would you do that? I said, well, Charles, no offense, you're very sick. And if you die, it's going to be front page news. And meanwhile, I'll be the guy in Vancouver with posters all over town saying Charles Lynch must die. I think that's in very poor taste. I'm going to cut my losses here. And he said, well, how long is the run anyway? And I said, well, 6-7 weeks. And he said, okay, I promise you I won't die until you're done. But don't take my name off that poster. So I didn't. And then Charles had a miraculous recovery. He lived for many, many years. And it was many, many years later, I was doing television, and Charles passed away. And probably a week after he passed away, an envelope appeared in the mail, and it was the bulletin from his funeral. And attached was a sticky note. And in his handwriting, it said, "Dear Rick, for your files, regards, Charles." So he got the last laugh.
So you move on for your next one-man show. And I'm starting to sense a theme here. After Charles Lynch Must Die comes, I've killed before, I'll kill again. But you're not referring to killing as in murdering. You're referring to killing in the show business vernacular.
Yeah, and
I killed.
And to be clear, Charles wasn't dead. It's not like I called him.
No, I know that.
But yeah, and it was so cocky. Like I'm amazed when I look back at the things I did as a very young man. That if I knew now. If I knew then what I know now, I never would have done it. I never would have done that first one-man show because the offer was come to Ottawa, write a show and perform a show in like 6 weeks. It's not enough time. But I said, oh yeah, sounds like a lot to me. Plus 6 weeks work. I don't think I ever had 6 weeks work as an actor before or a writer. I mean, I was washing dishes and posing naked for still life classes to pay the bills.
Yeah.
So I took it. And when we had to do the second show, imagine how cocky it is to call your show "I've Killed Before I Kill Again," but that's what we did, and it was really kind of tempting the critics and everyone who were, into the first show. But as luck would have it, hubris and youth carried the day, and the second show worked out well as well.
Ted Woloshyn returns in a moment.
You know, June is birthday month at Tom's Place. We celebrate all month long. Tom's 67th birthday is June 7th. Annette's big day is June 9th. And finally, Tom Jr. celebrates on the 13th. Throw in Father's Day and Canada Day, and you've got a month-long party. We know how to celebrate with birthday deals like 100% wool suits from $167. Selected dress and casual pants, along with shirts, just $67. Sports jackets starting at $167. Plus, many more deals all month long. Don't just be a spectator. Get in on the fun. Join the party and head over to Tom's Place. They're located at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Give yourself a present this June with a birthday deal on men's brand name business attire. Wish Tom happy birthday on Facebook for a chance to win a $670 shopping spree. Tom's Place will suit you. Have you been tasked with the role of a state executor or expected maybe in the future you will be? Well, if so, let me make your life a lot simpler by introducing you to my friend Debbie Stanley. Debbie is the founder of ETP Canada. They specialize in estate administration. Their goal simply is to help Canadian executors understand their role and how to deal with the loved one's estate. Let's face it, there's no school for this, but ETP Canada offers services such as executor support, estate accounting, and they have a new online course called Executor Ready. It's an engaging video designed to make estate administration easier and affordable. And those are two comforting thoughts during a stressful time. So call Debbie Stanley at 1-866-309-0387. That's 1-866-309-0387. Or you can get her at info@etpcanada.ca. That's info@etpcanada.ca.
Now back to Ted Woloshyn.
Speaking to Rick Mercer, who's just written a memoir called Talking to Canadians. We'd mentioned Codco before. Codco, after a 5-year run on television, eventually split up. Suddenly, you found yourself in a situation where television was going to be your future, and you teamed with Mary Walsh, Kathy Jones, and Andy Jones, all from Codco. Andy Jones quits the show before it even begins, and he's replaced by Greg Tomey. Now, you've got this program. You don't know what it's going to be called. You're not even sure what it's going to be like, but you know that you're guaranteed 8 episodes, and the budget is about a fifth of what Codco's budget was.
Yeah. Everyone says, oh, we had no money, but we really had no money. The producers kept that from us, and would have been nice had they let us in on it, because it was a very fractious creative process. As you can imagine, it's 4 very different people, with 4 very different ideas of what this show could be. All I wanted was a news desk, and other people didn't want a news desk, or there could be a news desk, but they didn't want it to be all about a news desk. Eventually, I won the day, not because I had the best idea. It was all they could afford. They couldn't afford anything else.
Right.
So I won the day. The budget dictated the fact that the show could only have a news desk. And for the longest time during the creative process, I really thought the show wasn't going to work. I just thought there's too many competing visions, and just too many things were going to go wrong. And this is why I pitched really hard the rant, me doing a 1-minute, 30-second commentary directly to camera, no edit points, no costume, just me to camera. And the producers went for it, not because they were sold on the idea as great television, but because it was the cheapest 90 seconds in probably Canadian television history. It was just dirt cheap.
And as opposed to all the other members of your cast who are always doing some sort of a character, you appeared as yourself doing these rants, but by the same token, you weren't allowed to use Rick Mercer, your name. You had to be a character called J.B. Dixon, who was loosely named after J.D. Roberts. Guy.
That was one of the battles I lost, but I can't say I went to the wall. I remember being so shocked It's like, finally, okay, we're going to have a news desk. We're all going to sit at the news desk and we're going to do stories and interview people. And then someone said, what's your name going to be? And I was like, what do you mean? What's my name going to be? My name is Rick Mercer. They were like, oh, no. And people just have different views. You got Kathy Jones and Mary Walsh, two great character comedians.
Yeah.
They inhabit characters. That's where they're the most comfortable. So they just thought, of course, if they're going to sit at a news desk, they're going to create a comic character that will deliver the news. It wouldn't occur to them to appear as themselves. And so I lost that battle. But the people who own the TV show were adamant that you could never use your real name. And I didn't really realize that until a couple of years later when I just started slipping it in, and they would edit it out. And it was a very strange hill for them to die on, but it was a deal breaker. And it took a very long time until I could use my name. It took until Talking to Americans. So Talking to Americans, we were doing inside of the show.
The show was called This Hour Has 22 Minutes. For those not old enough to remember, loosely based, the title at least, on a show called This Hour Has 7 Days.
Yeah. And the whole point was it was very topical. It was about the week. But then I just stumbled upon this piece called Talking to Americans. It became such a huge hit.
Oh, yeah.
So one day when I was in Washington, I would always start off and say, welcome to, and then Talking to Americans. And this time I said, I'm Rick Mercer, and this is Talking to Americans. And when it played back in the studio, I don't think anyone in the audience knows, but the people who own the company that owned the show, they certainly noticed, and they had my name removed, and words were said to the effect of, you'll never use your name on this show. It's J.B. Dixon or nothing. And so I became nothing. I just refused to ever say J.B. Dixon. But then when Talking to Americans became more and more popular, and then eventually there was a talk of an hour-long network special, Gerald had one demand only, and it's Rick Mercer's Talking to Americans, and name above the title, and he says it in the opening comments. And so after that, the barrier was broken, and I could use my own name for the show.
Talking to Americans, you film segments in Washington, you film segments at Harvard University, you filmed in Little Rock, the home of soon-to-be President Bill Clinton. And you would set up scenarios and ask Americans to comment on Canadian news items, one of which was the summit, the Benmergui-Clinton summit, telling people that our prime minister was Ben Mergui. Of course, he took the name from Ralph Benmergui, who was doing a late-night talk show on CBC television at the time, and people would comment on that. And you shot outside or in front of Mount Rushmore and told people that Canada owned the plutonium rights in Mount Rushmore, and in order to find out whether it was worth anything, they had to drill through the heads of the presidents to check the quality of the plutonium. People bought it.
And, they always bought
it. But they didn't even really get pissed off. They were thinking like, well, if you have to do this, can you do it from the back so that won't?
Well, that's what shocked me about that. No one said, no, you can't drill into the president's heads. And no one said, who in the God's name sold the mining rights to Mount Rushmore to the Canadians? They just accepted that. That was their commitment to the almighty dollar, and drill, baby, drill. I mean, they're willing to drill into the heads. They're willing to drill in Alaska. It was so much fun because this doesn't happen very often. I'm on a hit show, you can imagine, and suddenly I stumble upon this thing that there's just this insane appetite for. It's kind of like SCTV was a hit TV show, and then the boys did a sketch that was an afterthought, that was half improv, called Bob and Doug McKenzie, that was making fun of CanCon rules, and they just banged it off and kind of came up with every hackneyed Canadian stereotype they can imagine, and Canadians loved it. And from then on, as a kid, all we cared about was, is Bob and Doug going to be on this week's episode of SCTV? And that's what Talking to Americans was like. Suddenly, there was a huge demand for it. It was super popular. It wasn't that hard. It was really, truly exciting.
But did you not feel a little bit of remorse, though? Because, I mean, you're painting Americans to be stupid. Or not stupid, but at least ignorant when it comes to their knowledge of Canada. And I think we all believe that growing up. It's the old people showing up at the border with skis in July.
Sure.
That thing. In your book, you said, quote, I felt it was a tad unsportsmanlike. It wasn't shooting fish in a barrel. It was more throwing dynamite in a shallow pool. All I had to do was stand there with a net and scoop them up as they floated to the surface.
Well, and I felt terrible too, because almost every single person who appeared on Talking to Americans, they did so because of this incredible feeling of generosity towards Canada. They mightn't have known anything about Canada, but I can't tell you how many times I'd be standing on the corner, I got the big camera, I've got my suit on, I got the mic in my hand, and I'd start to speak to someone, excuse me, sir, and they go, nope, they don't want to talk. And then I'd say, do you have a moment for Canadian television? Then they'd stop and they go, well, I guess I could talk to Canadian television. And so they were being very generous to do so. And their instinct, if it was an American news team, no, don't want to talk to you. So that used to make me feel bad. But I justified it by thinking they'll never know about this. There's no YouTube. Hadn't been invented yet. There's no way they'll ever know. They'll just go home and say, oh, I did a interview on Canadian news. Did you know that they're thinking of legalizing insulin in Canada? And I told them that I thought that was a good idea. And they just won't know any difference. And also, I guess, man's got to eat. But my father never, ever, to this day, ever speaks to me about anything that I do professionally or weighs in with any opinion. And it was the only time he said, oh, I saw that Talking to Americans. I said, oh, Dad, people love it. You wouldn't believe. He said, yeah, promise me you'll never do that again. It's terrible. Then he started talking about how, during the Halifax explosion, how the Americans sent sweaters up to help us. And I was like, stop it. I can't hear about that right now. I've got a show to do.
But they generally, the Americans, they generally like Canadians. I sound like Sally Field. They really like us, right?
Sure. But they were really happy when I told them that we were opening our first college. And obviously, because it's Canada, there was only agricultural related degrees. And they were like, oh, no, but give it time. Soon you'll be able to produce your own teachers and nurses. Well, thank you. But they were very happy for us.
Yeah. And then you got them to sign a petition telling Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, we referred to as the Right Honorable Paul Martin, I should say, Prime Minister in waiting, and then Ted Lemaire. Shit.
Yeah. Well, we started going to, when I did the thing at Mount Rushmore, someone said, Gerald said, I said, Mount Rushmore, I loved it. And I had this idea of going to national historic sites in America and using them as our backdrop because, I would love to visit national historic sites in America. And I knew they would make great backdrops. The problem was at Mount Rushmore is it was all bus tours and they were decidedly older. So when I came back with the Mount Rushmore tape, I said, oh, it's so funny. They all believe that we're going to mine the heads. And Gerald said, well, if you keep going to national monuments, you're going to have to rename the segment to Picking on Seniors. And then it was like, oh, you're right. They were all kind of old. So then we decided, and then people started saying, oh, these people, they don't know what they're saying. There's some sort of trick here. So I thought, we have to prove that they do know what we're saying and that we're not just picking on poor seniors. So we decided to go to Harvard University.
Yeah.
We know where the young and the brightest are. And then to really drive home the fact that these people know what they're saying, we created petitions and we made them read the petition out loud. Of course, they're all of them reading Paul Martin, Ted Lemaire, just made me, the 9-year-old boy inside of me, laugh because none of them were aware that they were saying Paul Martin shithead. And I guess I didn't bump into a French major, but the petitions were, urging Canada to consider stopping the policy of placing our seniors on ice floes and leaving them to perish. People were totally outraged about that. But no one said, why don't you ban it? They just wanted us to reconsider the policy. And we had the Saskatchewan seal hunt and the Toronto polar bear hunt and people decrying it as a terrible environmental crime against humanity and stuff like that. It was great fun. And the university students were so strident, they would just line up They would literally line up, and then as soon as one person signed the petition, they just step out of the way, and the next one would come in and take the petition and read it out and sign it with great indignity.
Well, I'm speaking with Rick Mercer. His memoir is called Talking to Canadians. We talk about your Talking to Americans special, just to give people an idea how popular it was. This hour had 22 minutes, was pulling in about 1.5 million viewers, I think, somewhere around there. And when you debuted Talking to Americans, you got a phone call. You were in Jamaica. Slako Klemke, who's head of English programming from CBC, calls and said you clocked in at 2.7 million viewers.
Yeah.
That's outstanding.
Well, we didn't know that was even possible.
Yeah.
Like it's not the Grey Cup.
Yeah, exactly.
I remember Gerald said that's Game 5 Stanley Cup numbers. It's not a Canadian team in the series, but still it's Game 5.
Yeah.
But it was that big a number. That's how popular it was. Yeah, it was astounding. It was astounding. It was so much fun. And then the special got a whole whack of nominations. And then 9/11 happened, and suddenly the joke didn't seem that funny anymore. And we pulled all the nominations. It would have been fine probably to keep them, but I didn't need any statues. My career was underway. And then we made the further decision to, much to Slako's chagrin and everyone else's, to not do the segment again and not do another special. I mean, because it's TV, you pull in 2.7 million on April Fools.
Yeah.
Hey, next April Fools, do another one.
Yeah, of course.
And do it for the rest of your life, maybe. And I just made the decision that it was threatening to become the thing and the only thing that I was known for. So we just stopped.
Is it true that you suggested to Slako or asked him if you could actually host the National one night?
Oh yeah, well that was years later, and
yeah.
And you know, I had a very good relationship with the CBC at the time, and you know, I never asked them for any favors, but I'm pretty sure I could, you know, they would do whatever they were in the Rick Mercer business. I was in the CBC business, and we were talking one time, and Slako was like, "What would you like to do next? What would you like to do next?" And I leaned in, and I said, "Listen, some Sunday night in the summer when no one's paying attention, let me read the National." And he looked at me, and I thought, maybe this just might happen. He said, "That is never going to happen."
Yeah.
Solid no, hard no. Yeah. And I can only imagine if Slako had to call management and say, "By the way, on Sunday night, Mercer's going to be reading the National."
Yeah. Let me talk about your lunch with Jean Chrétien. He's a prime minister at the time.
Yeah.
You invite him to lunch at Harvey's. Now, I'm wondering, Gerald, on your behalf, would have approached his people, at which point they probably would have said, "Are you insane? Why would the prime minister go and have lunch with Rick Mercer at Harvey's?"
Well, I will say this. It's the news producer of This Hour's 22 Minutes was a fellow by the name of Jeff Dion. And Jeff Dion left a news career. He ran the Supper Hour News in Halifax and went to work with me and Kathy and Greg and Mary in creating this show. And he was in charge of all those things. So it wasn't Gerald. Gerald was the creative side, but Jeff was the newsman. So Jeff would have called Hartley and said, you know, will Chrétien come on the show? Chrétien had appeared on the show at that point with Mark Delahunty in his office, probably a 20-minute shoot. And they said, well, we'll think about it. And then Jeff started pitching it that, well, this is going to take more time. And we want the prime minister to go and meet Rick at a Harvey's on the outskirts of Ottawa. And yes, they thought we were completely crazy because people go to the prime minister. The prime minister doesn't go to them.
Yeah.
You know, captains of industry go to Ottawa and go into his office. They don't, you know, the prime minister doesn't go down to Bay Street and walk into the Bank of Nova Scotia, goes the other way. So, but I had this notion because people had told me that Chrétien liked the Harveys. But I'd heard that Chrétien, when he would work late, on the way home, he'd have his car go through the drive-thru at Harvey's. He'd get a hamburger, a milkshake, and a fries. And then I had also heard that Aline Chrétien caught him one night. And she was like, you know, how many days a week are you eating the burgers and fries at 11:30 at night? She finds out a lot. So she put the kibosh on it. No more, right? Bad for your heart or whatever. So I thought, I'm going to call him up. I'll ask him to come to Harvey's with me. And he'll say yes, just because it's a chance to eat Harvey's. And when the wife finds out, he'll say, I had to. It was work. Because that's what guys are like. And they came back to me and they said, yes, the prime minister will meet you at Harvey's. And I was saying, see, I'm a genius. This is how much the guy loves a burger. And it was budget day, of all things. And you'd think the prime minister would be busy on budget day, biggest day in the parliamentary calendar. But no, off he went and met me that morning at Harvey's. But before we started the shoot, there was 2 burgers on the table and 2 milkshakes. And they passed me a burger and they passed Chrétien a burger, and his photographer was there. And he lay down on the floor with the camera and he said, okay, eat the burgers. So we both started eating the burgers, and the photographer takes like 50 photos, runs out of the restaurant, gets in a little Honda Civic and drives away. And Chrétien puts down the burger and says, okay, what do you want to do? And we do this big shoot with him. And he was so funny. It was ridiculous. His comic timing was impeccable. It was like doing a sketch with Eugene Levy or something. Mm-hmm. And so the next day, it's the day after budget day. And the day after budget day in Canada, the one thing you can be assured of is every newspaper in the country, no matter what, is going to have a picture of the finance minister delivering the budget, because it's the finance minister's day, right? It's not the prime minister's day. And the finance minister of the day was Paul Martin. And his nemesis. There was a lot of tension between Paul Martin and Chrétien. And this was Martin's big day, because this was the day he was announcing that they had slain the deficit. And anyway, the next day we woke up. Half the papers in the country had pictures of me and Chrétien goofing around at Harvey's with eating burgers. And I realized Chrétien didn't go to Harvey's with me because it was a good idea or he wanted to be on the show. He wanted to knock Paul Martin off the front page of as many newspapers as he could. So he had this goofy picture of him with the comedian eating burgers. And that was a real lesson in how things really work. So even though we got a great piece out of it, I was completely manipulated by the PMO.
You move on from This Hour Has 22 Minutes to a sitcom that you and Gerald put together called Made in Canada, but it's a sitcom. Yeah. It's something that unlike and it's not like anything you'd done in the past.
No, it was scripted. It was a half-hour scripted sitcom. I played a character. We had no business. We didn't know what we were doing. To this day, we laugh sometimes about the mistakes we made on that show. It was a great learning experience. I got to work with so many. We always brought in a guest star. So many great Canadian actors that I got to work with. It was exhilarating. Scripted is a lot of work, way more work than 22 minutes, way more work than the Mercer Report. But we did 65 episodes. We had a real rough start out of the gate. People really didn't like the show, the first 6, but Slocco gave us a chance to reinvent it for the second season. God love him. And we did, and the numbers came up, and it survived and did very well. And we sold it all over the world, and it was a good run. I guess we probably ran 4 or 5 years, something like that.
Yeah. Christmas in Kabul with Tom Cochrane.
Yeah.
Is a fascinating story. First of all, you go to Kabul. Did you have any idea of how dangerous it really was going to be?
No. On paper, we obviously did, because when Jeff sent me the proposal, Jeff and I had gone to Bosnia and we'd shot with peacekeepers, and it was really personally satisfying for the both of us. And we always said we'd like to do something else with soldiers overseas. Well, it was years later. We weren't peacekeepers anymore. Right. We were at war, and it was the early days of the war. It was things were pretty bad. And Jeff sent me this warning from the Canadian government that said civilians should absolutely not travel to Afghanistan. It is not safe in any region. Warlords are actively targeting any civilians. There's suicide bombings. There's, these types of things happening. Just do not go. And I read this, and then Jeff said, "Do you want to go?" at the bottom. And I was like, well, I guess with an offer like that, I can't say no. And we decided to do an old-fashioned Christmas show, variety show, comedy and music, and do it on the Canadian base in Afghanistan. And because of our experience with Bosnia, the Canadian forces trusted us, and they said yes. And then the CBC thought about it. And the CBC is in the business of putting people in harm's way, but generally they put war correspondents in harm's way, not rock stars and comics. And so they eventually came around, and we went off to Afghanistan and did that show. And it was just great. and again, very personally satisfying. And it, it was a bit embarrassing because you're there creating a TV show and everyone's so grateful that we were there. And they were under a lot of stress and lost Canadian soldiers. It was Christmas. And they were so grateful to us for going to do the show. I just thought this is all upside down and ass backwards. I mean, we're the ones who should be grateful for you. We're just here doing a show, which is what we do. And we're leaving, by the way, very soon, whereas you're here for the long haul. And I decided that I would continue doing shows, and I kept doing shows, but I stopped bringing cameras because the cameras kind of got in the way of the experience. And so the next 2 or 3 times that I went back, there were no cameras around, but they were equally as rewarding.
Your next venture was the one, your most recent venture, Rick Mercer's report, and it was all based around a philosophy that Gerald had, a philosophy, the notion of celebration, to celebrate.
Yeah, and it doesn't. Celebrating doesn't come natural to comedians.
No, it's
writers.
The opposite.
It's the opposite. When you're a kid, you don't get laughs by celebrating the teacher. You get laughs by taking them down.
Yeah, exactly.
And all comedians, that's their instinct, and mine as well. And, a good takedown I enjoy as much as the next person. But Gerald felt that there was a lane that was free, and it was a lane where we would celebrate everywhere we went, to a ridiculous notion, like not even the slightest aside about a place that we were visiting. If it wasn't positive, we didn't say it. And it worked. And It was a bit of a learning curve, but it became second nature to me. And I'm really, really pleased that we took that road. I'm not saying that everything about Canada is perfect. It's not a jingoistic thing. I'm not saying that we shouldn't take time to reflect on things that we've gotten terribly wrong, all of those things. But it was just for a half hour every week. When I traveled around the country, it was about celebrating what was good about Canada. Yeah. And I think people responded to that in a really positive way.
I love the show's philosophy. Quote, "At this show, we don't shit on Thunder Bay."
That's right. Absolutely. And we had to say that a lot because I worked with some of the great Canadian comedy writers, but like I say, it doesn't come as, you get a bunch of Toronto writers or whatever. It's not second nature to celebrate Thunder Bay.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as someone whose mother came from Thunder Bay, I'm glad you decided that.
Well, thank you very much. And you know what it's like? When I grew up, the place I was from was a punchline.
Yeah.
And that always drove me insane. And I always hated any time anyone did that. The only time I ever got into the only time I ever got into a serious argument or I did something that could have been career ending for me because I just snapped was I was in Ottawa. I have to be careful about who I say now. Who I say this one. But anyway, the person that I was putting a microphone on is a very powerful individual who, quite frankly, could have made our lives miserable when it came to shooting in Ottawa or anyways, that type of person. And I traveled with a fellow, and he was from Winnipeg, and this person said to him, where are you from? And he said, Winnipeg. He said it proudly, Winnipeg. And the guy said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and then kind of walked away. And I just kind of snapped. I was like, "What the do you mean by that?" I said, "Why would you say that to someone?" And he's like, "Oh, I didn't mean anything by that." And I hate that. There's nothing more than I hate than that. And so that was why the philosophy was, we don't shit on Thunder Bay. If we go to Thunder Bay, it's because it's the greatest place on earth. And same goes for Winnipeg and New Brunswick, anywhere in New Brunswick. I mean, that's just the way it is.
And this is why I said at the outset of this conversation that this was like a monologue, a warm and fun rant.
Well, thank you very much.
It's not dark and evil at all.
No, that's the next book.
It is a great book. It's called Talking to Canadians, the author Rick Mercer. I can't thank you enough for this time that you spent.
Oh, thanks for having me.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
The Ted Woloshyn podcast has been brought to you by Tom's Place. For the finest in men's clothing at unbeatable prices, it's Tom's Place at 190 Baldwin in the heart of Kensington Market. Tom's Place will suit you. And ETP Canada, providing estate administration with ease. The Ted Woloshyn podcast is produced by me, Becky Coles. Technical production by Paul Gatt. Music by Bike Thieves. For more information on this podcast and our sponsors, and to talk to Ted, go to www.tedwoloshyn.ca.